We live in a very complicated world. As humans, we possess the unique responsibility of dealing with the present and what is yet to come simultaneously. To succeed, we must, in some sense, use the information we have to predict the future. The greater your ability to guess what the future might look like, the greater your ability to survive and thrive. While there are many important things in life, the universal constant in the human world is money. It is the key to accessing all other resources, and it's critical that you understand not just how to make, save, invest, and use it, but what money actually is, and what it might look like in the future. In order to understand the necessity of a solution, you must first understand the existence and nature of the problem it seeks to address. The following is what I hope to be an accessible and entertaining introduction to the problem of modern money. It is not meant to be comprehensive. While later content will look at many concepts discussed here at a more granular level, this is a broad strokes overview of why our monetary system is broken, and the proposal of what I and many others believe to be a solution to that brokenness. I am Yevgeny Nourish, and this is the Orange Pill. Section 1. The world is flubbed. I want you to close your eyes and imagine a world. Assume the following. The most important resource in this world, and the one that all other occupants of the world compete for and conduct trade with, is an arbitrary unit of value called flubbo. This flubbo is produced by a central governing authority. We'll call it the Flubberal Reserve, the flub for short. Even though it's the most important resource, and the one upon which all trade, commerce, livelihood, and survival are based on, only the flub knows anything about its total circulating supply, and even they aren't 100% sure. Furthermore, the flub is the only group of people who can produce more flubbo. They can do so for any reason they choose, and have virtually no oversight and answer to no other authority. On paper, it might seem like this world couldn't possibly have any problems. If ever there exists a scarcity of any good, the flub can simply print more flubbo and subsidize the production of that good. Except that every time new flubbo gets introduced to the system, it reduces the value of all flubbo that already exists. Here's an example of what that might look like. You, the viewer, and myself, the author, work for a company called the Flubbinator Enterprises. The three of us trade our flubbo between each other for products, services, and labor. We each make a salary of 500 flubbos a month. The flub burger we have for lunch is 5 flubbos, our daily coffee is 1 flubbo, and our rent is 150 flubbos per month. Because we know how far our flubbos go, we can make accurate determinations about what our flubbos will buy, which allows us to do things like budget, save, and plan for the future. Maybe we'll marry a flubbette or have little flublings. The point is, when we know how much a flubbo is worth in terms of what it buys, it allows us to think ahead about the best way to use our valuable flubbos. One day, we find out that Flubbinator Enterprises made some bad bets on the flub market, and they lost a lot of flubbos. More flubbos than you or I could ever imagine making in our entire lives. Flubbinator is going to go out of business if they don't get some help, which means you and I may lose our flubbing jobs. They ask the flub for a loan of 1 million flubbos to bail them out, and, thank goodness, the flub says yes. They make 1 million more flubbos, give it to Flubbinator, and everybody moves on. Business as usual. However, something strange happens soon after. The flub burger that's been 5 flubbos as long as we've worked here now costs 8. Our daily coffee is 1.5 flubbos now, and when we go to renew our lease, we find that our landlord is asking for 250 flubbos a month. Everything's gotten so expensive. Must be a sign of the times. At least we'll get a pay raise to account for the cost of living, right? We sure do. A whopping 10 more flubbos a month. Barely enough for a flub burger. Worse than all of this, we find out that things are more expensive for everyone who uses flubbo, even the people that don't live in our city or work for Flubbinator, who presumably had nothing at all to do with its flubnatural troubles, and who certainly didn't need, want, or ask the flub to step in and print all those flubbos. Now, open your eyes. I'm sure you've realized that you didn't ever have to imagine that world, because you're living in it. Our flubbo is the US dollar, and every year, the circulating supply increases arbitrarily at a rate that we can't control. This is called monetary supply expansion, and it is the largest contributing factor to what we call inflation. That is, the increase in nominal price of goods against the real value of the currency those goods are purchased with. Our Flubbed, the Federal Reserve, tells us that there is a 2% yearly inflation target, and that there are many factors that contribute to inflation. But the reality is that some years they, in conjunction with the Treasury Department, print 2% more, and some years, like in 2020, they print 20% of the entire existing supply of US dollars, which very obviously results in much greater than 2% inflation. They also find increasingly inventive ways to lie to us about the rate at which the money we work for is rendered worthless. Here's one fun example of how they do it. The Fed reports inflation based on the prices of a list of goods called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Things like bread, milk, eggs, and other commonly purchased household goods, goods that they get to decide on. If the Fed misses their 2% target, which they do every year, year after year, for nearly as long as they've existed, they can simply choose different goods whose prices have not been as dramatically impacted. Perhaps because more of that good was produced in a given year while demand remained the same, or for any other number of possible reasons that the price of a given individual good remains stable. Maybe the 2017 CPI is based on oat milk and organic eggs and artisan bread, but 2018 is 2% milk, factory farmed eggs, and Wonder Bread. By manipulating the index of goods inflation is measured against, the Fed can effectively say that inflation is whatever number they want. The reality is that while some years inflation is lower and some years inflation is higher, inflation is always there, like an infestation of insects and rodents, chewing away at your money year after year. As a quick thought experiment, let's base inflation purely on the cost of a McDonald's Big Mac. In 1980, an average Big Mac cost $1.60. In 2000, that same Big Mac cost $2.40, about a 55% increase. In 2020, an average Big Mac was $4.50, about a 90% increase from 2000. If we do the math, and again, this is purely based on the price of one good, according to the Fed's target, it should have taken about 28 years to bridge the gap between the cost of the 1980 and 2000 burgers. And it should have taken 45 years to bridge the gap between 2000 and 2020. If we base the average real rate of inflation on the Big Mac, we see that it's actually 4.5%, over double the Fed's target in the last 20 years. I am repeating this point to drive home the undeniable existence of the problem, because, again, in order to understand a proposed solution, you must first acknowledge that a problem exists. Because on its face, even 4.5% compounding annual inflation doesn't sound that bad. Until you understand that it means about every 15 years, the value of your money is halved. $100 of purchasing power today, right now, as I say these words, will be worth $50 in 2037 at that rate of inflation. And in case you haven't been following the news at the time of this recording, inflation is currently 7.7%. At the current rate of inflation, that halving of value occurs every 10 years. Please keep in mind, that's the number that's being reported by the Fed, who, if you recall, are capable of and heavily incentivized to manipulate the reported rate of inflation. It's very likely that real inflation is in the double digits, and while rate hikes offer a short-term solution, it is a guarantee that at some point in the future, and sooner rather than later, those printing presses are going to turn back on. Inflation is just one part of an infinitely connected web of lies, debt, and fraud that our current system, what we call the fiat system, is based on. The US dollar, starting in 1879, was on what is called the gold standard. The dollar was backed by US gold reserves, meaning that there was a relatively stable exchange rate between gold and dollar bills, and that the US could only print as much money as it had gold to back it. Dollars could be exchanged for gold at any US bank at a predictable rate. This gave our currency an attribute called hardness, the relative difficulty of obtaining a good or currency. This is a highly desirable quality for holders of that good or currency, since it means they're able to store value in that currency across time without fear of debasement through inflation of supply. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but roughly speaking, the harder it is to make, the more it's worth. There are much more detailed histories of the gold standard than I am able to give here, but in 1933, President Roosevelt effectively confiscated all gold and gold certificates from U.S. citizens, then announced that gold was 70% more valuable after that seizure, thus ushering in the era of inflationary monetary policy for the United States. From 1933 to 2022, the US dollar has lost over 2,000% of its purchasing power, meaning the average real rate of inflation over that period of time is actually 8.75%, over quadruple the Fed's proposed target. In 1971, Nixon officially ended the gold standard by forbidding the exchange of US dollars and gold, and the US dollar became what we call a fiat currency. Fiat is a Latin word that literally translates to arbitrary determination by authority. Fiat is money that isn't backed by tangible assets like gold. Instead, it's backed by trust. Trust in the government, trust in banks, and trust in a ferociously competitive world to be nice and honest with you. Fiat, since it can be printed by governments at will, grants an absurd amount of power to those governments, the power over value itself. Fast forward to today. Most countries denominate their debt in the US dollar, which in turn is backed mostly by other debt. Since 2012, the United States has incurred more debt each year than the entire collective value of the goods and services it produces. We currently sit at $31 trillion of debt and a 123.7% debt to GDP ratio, meaning that as a country, we are in so much debt that if we were to sell every real asset our treasury owns, we wouldn't even be able to make the interest payments on our existing debts to our own citizens and the foreign nations that hold that debt. Those interest payments, as of 2022, are about $766 billion per year. In fact, debt, mostly in the form of bonds, is the good that we produce more of than anything else. Except, of course, that debt isn't a good, or an asset, or anything positive. It's purely a liability, and it's only as good as the ability of the debtor to pay the creditor. This begs the question, how does a country pay down debts this substantial? There are two common answers. The first is simple. Print more money. Since the US has the privilege of being the global reserve currency, we can simply issue more dollars, reducing the real value of our debt and allowing us to pay it off with the freshly printed bills, at the low cost of inflating away the savings of its citizens until they're all impoverished. This is the cycle of debt and inflation, and it doesn't end until option 2 is on the table: economic and military conflict with our creditors. You're probably asking, how and why has this been allowed to happen? It's a very long story, only part of which I'm able to tell you. In fact, it's the story of the entire history of money, and there are many people more qualified than I am to tell it. But it boils down to one thing: trust. It's also very likely that what you're thinking right now is something like, it can't possibly be as bad as you're making it sound. Our economic and political leaders would never allow us to have reached such a precarious position if they didn't have a solid plan to get us out of it. As humans, we tend to believe that things are going to be okay. We want security and safety above all else, and it's hard to stomach the idea that the people who we put in power to protect us are abusing our trust for their own gain. It's hard to want to believe that bad things are going to happen, and it's even harder to act on those beliefs while simultaneously harboring the hope that everything's going to turn out fine if we just keep chugging along like we always have. The question is not whether the abuse is occurring, or if things are as bad as I'm making them sound. Unfortunately, those are facts. The question you have to ask yourself is, when have I had enough of the abuse? Is it a $10 Big Mac? How about 20? How about 50? The money printer corrupts absolutely. I don't even blame the people who turn it on. If I could print trillions of dollars and spin value out of thin air, I know that I would make myself and everyone I care about as rich as I could, as quickly and as quietly as possible, regardless of the consequences for anyone else. I would use that printer to accrue as much power as I could, for as long as I had control of it. And if you're honest with yourself, you'll see that you would too. Sure, maybe you'd help the starving children in Africa, or the homeless, or whatever your particular cause du jour is, but after a while, you'd only be doing it so other people kept trusting you with the money printer. Section 2. A quick review. To recap, the core problems we face with modern fiat currency, whether that's the dollar, the euro, or anything else printed by a central bank, are the following. 1. Its lack of hardness and scarcity, that is, how easy it is to manufacture or obtain. This is the difference between dredging a good like gold from the heart of the earth, washing it, polishing it, and transporting it to a destination, versus turning on a money printer and watching it spit out cash. 2. Its opacity. We can only make a rough approximation of the number of dollars in circulation, where and how those dollars are held, and the rate and mechanism by and with which those dollars are produced. Even if our currency's value was tied to another asset, like gold, we wouldn't know to what degree that value is diluted, because we don't know how many dollars there even are. Instead, we must hope that the responsible institutions are honest with us, which we know by now is not the case. Related to opacity is auditability. An overwhelming majority of US dollars held by US citizens are ostensibly held in banks. However, we know that banks have what are called fractional reserves, meaning that even if a bank held $1 million in customer deposits, it may only have 10% of that in its vaults. Effectively, this means that the number of dollars we see on our online banking dashboard or on a withdrawal slip is just that, a number. You and I have absolutely no way to monitor whether our actual dollars are held by the banks, other than to repeatedly withdraw our entire bank balance periodically to make sure that the banks are being honest. Not exactly a practical solution. If there were a financial crisis where everyone were to try to withdraw their dollars from their bank accounts, this is called a bank run, we would find that we're not able to do so. This has actually happened over a dozen times in US history, and it's part of the reason the Federal Reserve exists. In fact, bank runs were such a pervasive problem that in 1933, the same year Roosevelt confiscated everyone's gold, the U.S. founded the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, an institution that supposedly protects depositors from bank insolvency. In reality, the FDIC is woefully unable to enforce the standards that it creates, and in the event of another bank run, it's almost guaranteed that the solution to insuring customer deposits would be, you guessed it, to print more money in an attempt to make customers whole while simultaneously debasing their savings. While we do know the amount of physical cash in the system thanks to the Treasury's reporting, we have no idea how many of the dollars in the banking system are effectively IOUs. Most estimates have the total money supply, or M2, at about $14 trillion, while only 2 trillion actual physical dollars currently exist. You do the math on that one. 4. The centralization of its power. All the US dollars in the world are printed by precisely one institution, the Federal Reserve. As with all institutions that have monopolistic and absolute power, it was destined from its conception to become corrupt. Furthermore, whether or not you are a believer in democracy, the chairman of the Fed, who acts as both its primary decision-maker and spokesperson, is not an elected official. They are appointed by the acting president and approved by the Senate. In other words, we have effectively zero control over a single decision that is made in regards to the production and control of a resource that literally every single one of us relies on and spends our entire lives working for. Instead, we hope that a person we may or may not have voted for picks the second coming of Jesus Christ for the job of chairman of the Fed, and that person is subsequently approved by 100 other people we may or may not have voted for, the probability of which is, of course, 0. 5. Its transmissibility across time and space. Because of the inflation problem, the dollar is a terrible store of value. A dollar on its own produces nothing, generates no interest or yield, and, as we demonstrated with our Big Mac thought experiment, decays at an always alarming and often unpredictable rate, day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. If we do nothing but hold on to what we've earned, it just rots away. This means that if we are to preserve our money across time, for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren, we are forced to predict which assets will be an effective way to preserve the wealth we've worked hard for. They can A, spend thousands of hours studying which assets have historically performed well, then make assessments about whether or not that will continue to be the case. Keep in mind, these assets have to grow in value faster than the rate of inflation. Unless you're a trader, you are essentially forced to engage in an inherently unproductive activity in the hope of preserving and growing your money. An overwhelming majority of people do not have the time, the inclination, or the analytical ability to do this, and even if they did, it's unlikely that their investment decisions will outperform inflation. Furthermore, investing necessarily involves the adoption of risk, as for every winning trade, on the other side is a loser. If you are simply a working person looking to protect your earnings, oftentimes you are trading against someone whose literal job it is to deeply analyze the patterns of the market 80 hours a week using powerful computers and sophisticated trading software, and win those engagements. Option B is to trust someone else to grow your money for you, a wealth manager, a fund, or a 401k or similar retirement plan. This is what most people do. They take a percentage of the money that they worked for and hand it over to a professional money handler and pray that they make better bets than they would. Custodians like hedge funds often receive commissions for taking on new clients, not for actually making them money. Now, we're again back to the problem of trust. So, how do we fix the system? Sadly, it doesn't seem that we can. Eventually, many countries will begin the process of defaulting on their debts, and the dominoes will begin to fall. There will likely be violence. There will certainly be currency collapse. And at that point, the world becomes a game of musical chairs, where the loser is the last person holding a bag of dollars, or yen, or lira, or whatever currency, whatever country you happen to be residing in issues. It's happened in many countries throughout history before, and it's actually already happening today in much of what we think of as the developing world, parts of Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The fiat system is fraying at the seams of the developed world as well, and has been accelerated and brought to light by things like COVID, the European energy crisis, and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. However, the fiat system's irredeemable brokenness does not mean that there's not a solution. Human civilization is a story of questions whose answers came from somewhere completely outside of previously existing paradigms. Humanity is a story about technology, about engineering, about changing the world in ways that previous generations could not have even begun to imagine. The Romans solved the problem of distributing water through cities with the engineering solution of the aqueduct, and brought about an unprecedented wave of human flourishment for her people. Generation after generation, we iteratively improve upon the work of our predecessors. Wooden boats with a life cycle of 50 years became steel frigates with a life cycle of hundreds, capable of carrying orders of magnitude more people and goods around the world. Horses became insufficient for our ground transit needs, the engineering solution to which was the internal combustion engine in the first trains and automobiles. Section 3. The Orange Pill. On January 3rd, 2009, someone delivered yet another unprecedented technology: programmatically perfect money. That someone was an anonymous individual we know only as Satoshi Nakamoto, and that solution was Bitcoin. If fiat is a horse, Bitcoin is an interplanetary spacecraft. Bitcoin represents a trust-free, elegant, and practical engineering solution to all of the problems money has had throughout all of human history. It is difficult to obtain, mathematically scarce, completely transparent, absolutely decentralized, and is perfectly preserved across time and nearly instantaneously transmissible across space. Bitcoin is so many powerful things at once that it's hard to describe easily, and it can't possibly be completely understood by watching a single video or listening to a single podcast, which is why I've taken the time to write and record this as an easily digestible introduction. Before we get too far, it's probably helpful to provide a quick overview of what Bitcoin is and how and why it was created. On October 31st, 2008, right on the heels of the global financial crisis caused by the collapse of the U.S. housing market, the Bitcoin white paper was published by an individual with the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. The white paper, a 9-page document that I strongly recommend reading, and which will be linked in the description, describes an open source software network that allows peer-to-peer transacting without a trusted third party, like a bank or any other intermediary. Satoshi believed that such a network would disrupt legacy financial technologies and provide people freedom from the abusive system that led to the 2008 collapse, as well as all collapses preceding it. This protocol would be self-sufficient, and rather than relying on a centralized authority or issuer, transactions on the network would be verified by its users, each running the software on their personal computers, called nodes. Units of Bitcoin would be produced and protected by proof of work, a function that requires the expenditure of energy and time to brute force solve a complex puzzle. Proof of work is very important, so we'll get to that in more detail soon. But, in short, Satoshi described a protocol that would combine the utility of a payment network like PayPal, the security of an incredibly complex hashing algorithm backed by real energy in the form of electricity, and a currency native to the network, making it a closed, self-contained monetary system. Shortly after, Satoshi disappeared, and to this day, we don't know his identity. Most believe that he's dead, as the first Bitcoins ever mined, called the Satoshi coins, have been inactive since 2010. That all sounds nice enough, but it seems more like a fun thought experiment than the most powerful and disruptive financial innovation in human history. What makes Bitcoin so special? While Bitcoin is much more than an answer to the failures of fiat, a good place to start explaining its value is by describing why it is so antithetical to all monies that have preceded it. Before we really dig in, it's important that we're on the same page about something. The fact that we all live in two worlds at once. The physical world and the cyber world, the world of the internet. The internet is, of course, not bound by the same constraints as the physical world. Although computation abides by the laws of physics, the virtual environments that it produces are not. Perhaps the biggest innovation of Bitcoin is the one that is least well understood. It's the first technology humanity has discovered that bridges those two worlds, and in a very real way, it applies physical boundaries to a digital technology. I'll explain how that happens and why it's so revolutionary in the next segment. Segment 1. Hardness and Scarcity. The first problem we discussed in our review of fiat was its lack of both hardness and relative scarcity. It can be printed ad infinitum for any reason the controller of the press deems worthy. Bitcoin is the hardest money humanity has ever created, for a few reasons. First, it's important to understand how individual Bitcoins are produced, a process called mining. Each time a transaction is made on the Bitcoin network, it's added to the equivalent of a waiting room for unconfirmed transactions called a block. Before these transactions are confirmed by the network, the block that contains them must be proved valid and accurate. To do this, blocks must be hashed by miners. Once a block is hashed, it's added to a transparent public ledger of all previous transactions called a blockchain, and whoever controlled the computer that completed this computational proof of work, just another way of saying, I spent the computing power, so I earned the reward, receives a fixed number of Bitcoins. A block is hashed roughly once every 10 minutes, and each block contains roughly 2,000 transactions. This might sound trivial. After all, this is basically just the computer solving a puzzle through computation, which computers happen to be quite good at. However, Bitcoin uses something called Secure Hash Algorithm 256 to encode these blocks. This means that for every block, there are 2 to the 256 power possible solutions, a number so large that it is useless to describe outside of mathematical expressions. The number 1 billion, or 2 to the 30th power, has 3 commas. This number has 25. A good way to visualize this would be to imagine 64 puzzle pieces, each one with 62 sides, and each piece pure white. The only way to solve the puzzle is to match each individual piece with each other piece, and then repeat that process for each side, for each piece. As you can imagine, this is an extraordinarily difficult task. In fact, the odds of any given computer solving a block are roughly 1 in 22 trillion. There is no shortcut or heuristic to solve SHA-256, meaning that in order to hash the block, or solve the puzzle, miners must perform billions of computations per second. To effectively compete in the Bitcoin mining market, you must control thousands of specialized computers called Application-Specific Integrated Circuits, or ASICs, each running 24/7 and consuming the cheapest electricity that the miners can find. All this to say, the production of Bitcoin is unbelievably difficult because it requires computation, which in turn requires real-world energy in the form of watts. This is one of the greatest innovations of Bitcoin, a digital currency that enables us to store real power in a virtual world. It is the direct digital manifestation of power, measurable in watts, in cyberspace. This leads us to the equally important companion of hardness, scarcity. The incursion of real-world cost is essential to real-world value. Gold has maintained its value for thousands of years because it's difficult to extract from the earth. Bitcoin is the invention of true digital scarcity. Bitcoin has two key properties that make it perfectly scarce: an immutable fixed supply and a dynamic, ever-increasing difficulty in its production. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Ever. After the last one is mined, the new role of Bitcoin miners will be to secure the network via the collection of transaction fees. Unfortunately, nobody listening to this video will be alive to see the last block mined. It won't happen until roughly the year 2140. This is because, roughly every 4 years, an event called a halving occurs. The halving refers to the reduction in the amount of Bitcoin awarded to the miners who successfully hash blocks. While in its early days, each block awarded 50 Bitcoins, at time of writing the equivalent of 850,000 US dollars, currently each block only awards 6.25 Bitcoins. By 2025, that number will be 3.125, and by 2033, it'll be 0.78125. Every 4 years, a massive supply shock hits Bitcoin, and these tend to be the periods of time where the price explodes, as demand for Bitcoin increases year after year, while the amount produced steadily shrinks, working slowly but inexorably towards 21 million. Of course, something being scarce doesn't automatically give it value. If I make an ugly, misshapen vase, there may only be one of it, but that doesn't mean anybody wants to buy it. Very roughly speaking, all things are only as valuable as the desire of the market to purchase the item, divided by how many of the item there are. There is a lot of demand for perfect money, and not a lot of Bitcoin. Let's look at what other attributes make Bitcoin desirable. Segment 2. Transmissibility across space and time. Now would be a good time to explain how Bitcoin transactions actually work. Each person who owns and custodies Bitcoin possesses a Bitcoin wallet. This wallet has an address, represented by a string of random characters which functions like a unique identity, similar to a bank account. To transact with someone, you simply need to share your wallet addresses, choose how much Bitcoin you'd like to send to them, confirm the amount, and press send. This sounds a little bit like the existing wire payment system, or products like Venmo or Cash App, until you realize that there was no intermediary required, and the entire process happened instantly with final settlement. This is what is meant by transmissibility across space. No matter how far away these parties are, Bitcoin allows them to conduct their transaction instantly on internet rails. To demonstrate how much better this is than legacy banking, let's imagine two people, Sally and Josh, who want to transact with each other. It really doesn't matter why. If Sally wants to send Josh any amount of money, she has to call or go to her nearest bank branch, tell a human that she wants to send a wire, and pay $25 to $50 so that another human can move some imaginary numbers on a screen from Sally's account to Josh's. Even worse, depending on the time of day the wire was sent, it could take between 4 and 72 hours for Josh to receive the money and confirm the transaction. The cash was not shipped from Sally's bank to Josh's, which would perhaps justify the price tag and the time it took to clear. All that happened is that a few lines of code changed in the database of both banks. No actual value was transmitted, and no real service was performed. Furthermore, if that amount was greater than $10,000, Sally and Josh's bank would have to fill out a form that reports their transaction to the IRS, which in turn may trigger an audit or investigation. They then both have to disclose the nature of their transaction and confirm many aspects of their identity which could compromise their privacy. The same is true if Sally tries to withdraw any large amount of cash to do a physical handoff, which of course also requires a prohibitive amount of time, physical movement, and the security risk of carrying a big sack of cash around, which someone could just steal at any point in its transit to Josh, or even by Josh himself. All in all, this simple one-way transaction has cost many hours and an egregious amount of money to Sally, Josh, the financial institutions involved, and even potentially the federal government, plus compromise the privacy and potentially even the safety of two ordinary people trying to conduct a simple exchange of value. Now, let's take that same situation and use Bitcoin instead. If Sally wants to send Josh $10,000, she can open her mobile phone and send Josh a text over a secure messaging app of her choice or any other method of communication and ask Josh for his Bitcoin wallet address. Josh sends his address, she opens the wallet app on her phone, punches whatever the market value of $10,000 in Bitcoin at the time of the transaction is, and presses send. Sally pays less than 50 cents in transaction fees for her troubles. Josh receives the money immediately. No IRS audit is triggered, and at no point in the exchange was there a middleman to take a cut of the transaction, an opportunity for theft, the burden of physical movement of goods, or any chance for fraud or counterfeit to occur. The entire exchange could occur in a few minutes, with immediate final settlement. Seems a lot better, right? Let's run back in time again for another quick comparison to gold. I keep mentioning gold because, in many ways, Bitcoin is the technological and spiritual successor to it. Many Bitcoiners were former gold bugs, and likely still would be if Bitcoin hadn't been invented. Gold has always been a generationally transcendent store of value and a measure of wealth. Because it does not decay, a chunk of gold from thousands of years ago is almost materially identical then to what it is now, assuming that it wasn't damaged. Gold is an excellent store of value, both because of its relative scarcity and its durability. Throughout human history, if you wanted to pass along generational wealth, gold and land were basically the only things that stood the test of time. However, both gold and land fail to meet modern standards of transmissibility across space. Merely by existing in the physical world, moving any amount of gold, and especially larger quantities since it's so heavy, is a prohibitively difficult task. And, of course, land can't move at all, no matter how valuable it is. While gold served its purpose, and the human species will be forever grateful for its contributions to our understanding of what makes a good money and a good store of value, we should not be sentimentally beholden to an old technology when a better one arrives. An enormously powerful quality of Bitcoin is that it is equally transmissible across time and space. While Bitcoin can be used as a highly efficient peer-to-peer cash system, it can also be used as a store of value. In fact, at any time, you can see how many people have simply purchased or mined Bitcoin and held on to it, and for how long. We call long-term holders hodlers, both a humorous intentional misspelling of the word hold and an acronym meaning hold on for dear life. Most hardcore Bitcoiners fall into this camp. They believe that while the transmissibility of Bitcoin across space is extraordinarily useful, this is an asset that they want to hold across time, to give their descendants as an inheritance. In other words, Bitcoin is designed to travel 100 miles away as readily as it is to travel 100 years away. Bitcoin is built to last forever. Because the network exists in cyberspace on a distributed network of computers, the only way the network can ever fail is if electricity and the internet both permanently and simultaneously cease to exist. Even if you were to destroy each and every computer running a Bitcoin node today, a difficult task considering anyone on Earth with a computer can operate the software, it would be trivially easy to download the software on new computers and restore the network in a matter of hours, with the only consequence being a delay in transaction confirmation. Because Bitcoin is a digital commodity, it does not experience any physical decay, and it cannot be inflated into worthlessness because of its fixed supply and immutable programmatic deflationary mechanisms like halving. Bitcoin will outlive all of us, and as long as there is demand anywhere on Earth for freedom and hard money, it will continue to grow in adoption and value, as it has throughout its lifespan. Segment 3. Decentralization and Security. I mentioned before that another key failing of fiat monies are their issuance by a single entity, a central bank. While centralization can be good for organizations that need a small group of people to make decisions very quickly, like a company, it also creates a single and easily assailable point of failure, with many vectors of attack. If one person is in charge of all of the money, what stops someone from influencing that person, through the promise of power, wealth, protection, or even the threat of violence? A central authority is only as trustworthy as the person in charge, and the incentives, structure, and incestuous entanglement of modern government and modern finance all but ensure that only the most corruptible people have the most power over us. If we are to have perfect money, that money can't have a single point of failure or be subject to those corrupting influences. One of the first questions people ask about Bitcoin is, who controls it? A fair question, but one that reveals just how pervasive the fiat mindset is and how revolutionary a technology Bitcoin is. After all, we've never had a currency without an issuer. The answer to who controls Bitcoin is simple. Nobody. No individual on the network has more power than any other. The code is fully open source and has been reviewed by the most brilliant software architects on the planet and experts in cryptography many times over for the last decade and change. Even Satoshi himself, the architect of Bitcoin, has zero control over the network, assuming he's even alive. There are no backdoors, and the fundamental laws of Bitcoin are set in stone. However, this is not to say that Bitcoin cannot evolve. As with all new technologies, there is always room for improvement. Often this has to do with compatibility with new software, or a new understanding of specific elements of the protocol that increase its efficiency, security, or usability. The only way that upgrades can be made to the protocol is with the complete consensus of the network after an exhaustive peer review process. I'll explain in the simplest terms possible what that process looks like using the first major Bitcoin core upgrade, segregated witness, or SegWit for short. The upgrade itself is too complicated to explain in brief, but the process of implementing it is how the consensus mechanism for changes to Bitcoin were decided, and it's an important part of Bitcoin history. Step 1. A software engineer working on new ideas for Bitcoin scalability and security developed SegWit in 2015. He then suggested to the community. Today, this is called a Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, or BIP. Step 2. This BIP, for segregated witness, was reviewed by other software engineers, who suggested edits and aggressively tested the code against all possible scenarios over the course of 2 years. During this time, the SegWit proposal was shared with every part of the Bitcoin community: miners, node operators, hodlers, Bitcoin business owners, and non-core developers, to obtain feedback and learn what the concerns of the entire community were. There was a lot of debate whether or not it was acceptable to change any part of Bitcoin, even if those changes would increase adoption, attract developers, and improve security and scalability, with very few trade-offs. Step 3. The Bitcoin Core development team implemented SegWit in a closed test environment and found it to be stable. Step 4. Ultimately, it was decided that segregated witness would have to be backwards compatible with the existing Bitcoin software to avoid what is called a hard fork. In other words, the splitting of Bitcoin into two different protocols, the old and the new. It would be released as an upgrade, but the previous version of Bitcoin could still transact with nodes using SegWit to preserve the integrity of the network. Miners and node operators could choose which version they wanted to run, which means the consensus would be reached by adoption. Essentially, users would vote on which version they preferred simply by using it, but both versions would be valid. The old nodes just wouldn't have access to the upgrades that SegWit brought with it. Step 5. In 2017, SegWit was released, and node operators, miners, and users all decided which version of the software they would use and run. Thanks to the intensive review process, SegWit was an overwhelming success that brought new life to Bitcoin and allowed the advent of many new Bitcoin businesses built on top of the network. Nobody was forced or coerced into running the updated software by a central authority, a threat of violence, or exclusion from the network. Today, over 98% of nodes run the SegWit upgrade, and the consensus mechanism continues to be one of exhaustive peer review and community solidarity. As you can see, no matter how big or small, or good or bad a proposed change may be, it requires every part of the community, and most importantly of the miners and node operators, to implement that change. The people who have the most to lose by sacrificing Bitcoin's core values are the ones who make the decisions, which creates a perfect alignment of incentives. It's in all of our best interests to preserve Bitcoin's purity and integrity. Bitcoin's development philosophy is the opposite of Facebook's mantra, move fast and break things. Our community moves very, very slowly, and we make sure that any change is as close to perfect as code can be before it's deployed. Bitcoin is built on adversarial thinking. It is not optimistic about human nature, and it does not believe that the world is sunshine and rainbows, or that enemies of freedom will allow it to exist uncontested. In fact, the white paper contains the word attack 25 times in 9 pages. Decentralization is part of what gives Bitcoin its unbreakable resilience to all vectors of attack. With just over 106 million users distributed across the planet and growing daily, It's difficult, if not impossible, to imagine how any bad actor or group of bad actors could threaten or coerce people to behave in a way that threatens the integrity of the network. With so many failsafes built into Bitcoin's code, in addition to the philosophy of its users, it's more strongly defended against those bad actors than any technology, physical or digital, that has come before it. Segment 4. Transparency. In the hardness and scarcity section, I used the phrase transparent public ledger to describe the Bitcoin blockchain, but I didn't explain what that actually means. I'll use gold once more to demonstrate the fundamental failure of lack of transparency in a money or asset. While gold has been used as a currency and a store of value for virtually as long as it's existed, there's no way to know how much gold is in circulation. Estimates have the total amount of mined gold throughout human history between 150,000 and 200,000 tons, a pretty wide margin for error. As I've mentioned before, gold is unwieldy, heavy, and difficult to transport, meaning that in order to effectively trade with it, central banks invented paper gold, essentially certificates or coupons that represent a set amount of gold. Rather than holding a ton of gold in my home or with a trusted third party like in a bank vault, I could hold a certificate for a ton of gold, called paper gold, and trade that certificate with someone in the event that I need to use it. However, as anyone with a functional brain might imagine, paper is much easier to manufacture than gold, and the paper gold system is completely opaque. We run into the same problem all easily printed paper money has. There's absolutely no way of knowing if the gold certificate you hold has the equivalent amount of gold backing it, without attempting to withdraw the gold. Let's use the largest gold market in the world by volume, the London gold market, as an example of just how broken this system is, and how ripe for fraud even one of the most time-tested and trusted commodities in the history of humanity is. In 2016, the London gold market alone traded 1,355,400 tons of paper gold. Remember, the high end of estimates have the entire supply of gold mined in all of human history at 200,000 tons, meaning that the London gold market by itself, in the best case scenario, trades 67 times the amount of gold that exists in the world by volume. Of that traded gold, 95% of it was unallocated and without a legal title, meaning that there's no verification that there is even a real gold analog to back the paper gold that's being traded. In fact, only about 6,500 tons of gold are even stored in London, about 0.4% of the total traded supply. What would happen if everyone holding paper gold decided to call the bluff of the issuers of those certificates and attempt to redeem them? Most gold experts maintain that the supply of paper to real gold is about 250 to 1. Said differently, for every 15 pounds of fake gold, there exists only about 1 ounce of real gold. Once again, we see that given the ability to produce value from thin air for their own gain, humans will choose to do so without fail, and other humans will participate in the illusion in the vain hope that they are the 1 in 250 people that isn't a sucker. In order to have perfectly trustless money, that money has to be impossible to fraud or counterfeit. The best way to achieve this is to ensure that everyone who uses the money has perfect and equal visibility into the total circulating supply and validity of the money. Bitcoin does this simply and elegantly. When blocks of transactions are added to the blockchain, they are essentially published for all users of the network to see on a public ledger, a history of every transaction that's ever occurred on the network. Each node has the exact same copy of that ledger and broadcasts it to all the others, meaning that anyone can fully audit the supply of Bitcoin, the validity of all transactions, and the amount contained in each wallet at any time. A Bitcoin wallet gives you complete sovereignty and control of your money. Only you control the coins in your wallet, which is secured, in addition to your address and wallet password, by a seed phrase, 12 to 24 randomly generated words in a specific sequence that you can write down, memorize, or keep safe in any number of ways that guarantee access to your wallet and that only you know. This wallet does not ask for your identity or anything about you, and without someone knowing both your wallet address and identity, which you would have to give them, it is perfectly private. In other words, you have a digital proof of your money's existence without giving up any information about who you actually are to anyone you don't want to have that knowledge. An important innovation in a world where privacy is increasingly violated by banks and other institutions, and identity theft is rampant. Section 4. In closing. There's been a lot of information in this video, but I hope that it was sufficiently interesting to capture your attention for however long it ends up being. This was originally meant for friends and family, and if you're listening to this and fall into those categories, I would be thrilled to have a conversation about Bitcoin with you and answer any questions you might have, as well as help you set up your wallet and take your first steps in your Bitcoin journey. If I don't know you personally, feel free to drop a comment below and I'll do my best to respond. As hard as it is to accept that we live in a broken world, I hope you agree that the fiat world is broken. A system that is built on debt, fraud, credit, and lies cannot last forever. We know this from thousands of years of financial history, and we know this from experience, because we've all lied, we've all been indebted, and we all know the pain associated with our inevitable failures as a result of both. I am the farthest one can be from a moralist or an alarmist crying that the world will end. But if we continue to place faith in a system built on evil principles, we are, in a very real sense, participating in the proliferation of that evil. I believe that Bitcoin is the answer to financial evil, and I have put everything I have into that belief. This technology has changed my life for the better, and not just because it's enriched me financially, but because it has forever altered my understanding of the world. I denominate my net worth in Bitcoin terms, not dollar terms. It has shifted the orientation of my life from short-term gains and hedonistic self-fulfillment to a perspective of how can I build, own, and be a part of things that outlive me and enrich the world. It has clarified my understanding of the incentives that shape the world and how we can build a better one if we possess the tools to incentivize a world defined by financial freedom rather than financial tyranny and abuse. This is just an introduction. I've personally spent hundreds of hours studying Bitcoin, economics, modern finance, and the history of money. In 2014, I started as a skeptic, as you should, and I expected to find things that discredited Bitcoin or caused me to doubt its potential as a solution to the problems we face. But my conviction has only increased the more that I've learned. The value proposition of Bitcoin only becomes clearer as issues like inflation grow worse and greater degrees of corruption are revealed each day. Even if all of these issues were to be solved tomorrow, there has still never been a harder, more secure store of wealth in all of human history. Don't just take my word for it. Do your own research, and I'm sure you'll find the same to be true for you. As Bitcoiners say, don't trust, verify. If you found this content to be helpful in improving your understanding of Bitcoin, please drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this with anyone you feel would benefit. I'll be creating new written and recorded content every week, discussing different economic, geopolitical, and political problems we collectively face, and why Bitcoin is the most powerful defense we have against those problems. Thanks for listening.